Okay. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see familiar faces. So the way we're going to proceed, I think, is Chris is going to pretty much go through his lecture, and I'm going to be taking the questions as they come, and then we'll make some time at the end to answer them. So you can just put your questions in the chat box as they pop up, and if there's like relevant questions and there's like little windows of time, maybe I'll interrupt Chris to ask your questions. And yeah.
I'm going to go through pretty fast because I'm trying to get to the point where we're really talking about the lunar zodiac and the lunar mansions and you know, kind of to the points that we're driving at, rather than, you know, this isn't going to be a course in how to make talismans necessarily, but I am going to touch upon all of that material as is relevant, but I'm going to kind of speed through it and try to kind of get where we're planning on landing. So we're going to investigate what there is of literature on the lunar mansions, mostly kind of in the West and in the Arabic tradition, and then look for what's missing and look for like to scrutinize for some clues along the way. And we'll touch upon those like talismanic techniques and electional magical application as we go. So if we're talking lunar mansions, we're talking ecliptical divisions. You know, the tropical zodiac, the sidereal zodiac, and the constellational zodiac are all 12 sign ecliptical divisions. Tropical tracking solstitial and equinoctial points, sidereal, the stellar layer itself, and constellational, the observable irregular constellations, which is in, you'll see that more often in earlier astrological treatises, talking about like phenomenology of what happens in a certain part of the sky. You know, beyond, it's funny as Austin's still presenting right now, because, you know, beyond the 12 sign zodiac, like a way to think about different places is a further division of the solar decans. In Egypt, it used for ceremonial, magical, and ritual timing, often keyed into the ascendant and into a time of year. Whereas if we think of like the tropical zodiac, I kind of, when in framing how we think about it from a lunar perspective, instead, you know, we always think of like the tropical zodiac sort of as like, oh, well, it's seasonal. But if we kind of make seasons secondary and regardless of which hemisphere you're in or any of that, just in general, make seasons a secondary idea and just think of it as a cycle of light and darkness throughout the year, a cycle of how day and night changes as a division. And the sun goes through every 365-ish days and hits points of equal, most, or least light. And then the moon goes through the same cycle, and think of it as it like remembering that same cycle of light and darkness because it keys into those points. And so the solstitial and equinoctial tropical zodiac is defined by the sun, but remembered by the moon. And then that kind of pours into how we think about day sect versus night sect cyclically. And we'll come back to some of those ideas, but the ecliptical moon cycle is what we're talking about. So it's about 27.3 days. So that has Indian astrology breaking up into 27 nakshatras, and Chinese and Arabic astrology leaning more towards 28. And we'll see later that there's probably other cultures that that lean towards a 28 division, and even in early Indian astrology, there's evidence of a 28 division. So we're not talking phase, and we're not talking lunar day, but the moon against the stars, or the moon also in its tropical location. So when we see stuff in culture and in texts and in art that has a 28ness, we can identify it as talking about something that's a lunar zodiacal places, whereas if it were phase, it would be more, a lunar synodic cycle is 29.53 days. So they wouldn't throw out 28 as a number. That's the moon going around the ecliptic itself. And so the history of the mansions maybe Babylonian, Chinese, Indian. Several scholars think Babylonian as having lunar groupings slightly before the Indian, but also it all being related to Egyptian magical timekeeping and linking lucky and unlucky days of the month to favorable and unfavorable sections of the zodiac. So connecting lunar calendars and timekeeping techniques and phenomenological observations, and maybe this was ritual timing, and as the decans timed in Egypt rituals throughout the year, the mansions maybe were timing more regular magic, or magic throughout the month, but more likely like magic you would do all the time, not the timing of like festivals. And so Al-Biruni is the first to call the mansions a lunar zodiac in the 10th century. I'm not going to pronounce this right, but it's Manazil in Arabic, in his book of instructions in the elements of the art of astrology. And he was a scholar of physics and mathematics and astronomy and natural sciences, medicine, a historian, a chronologist, and a linguist. He was born on September 4th, 973, in the region now known as Uzbekistan and northern Turkmenistan. But he lived mostly in modern-day central eastern Afghanistan, which was, in 1017, he traveled to South Asia and wrote a study of Indian culture. I think he went down to the tip of India, and accompanying the ruler of the Ghaznavid dynasty as the court astrologer. That loosely fit over modern day Afghanistan. And he finished this book in 1030. So he was down there for quite a long time collecting a lot of information, and particularly interested in Hindu calendars, which he made conversions of dates to Greek, Arabic, Muslim, and Persian calendars in Islamic use at the time. He spoke his native tongue, and also Persian, Arabic, Sanskrit, Greek, Hebrew, Syriac, and so probably other dialects as well. And so definite polyglot, and accepting information from different places, as we'll see kind of comes up in How the Mansions Look in other texts. The earliest mention of the mansions come from him as a regular constellational sized boundaries, and then standardized later by Arabic and Western astrologers. Arabic astrology at the time was a blend of Greek and Middle Eastern and Indian astrology. And we have the lots, aspects, planetary relationships, planetary positions relative to the sun, rulerships, all this stuff. But he condemned horary as sorcery, which is important to think about as a cultural milieu, as where more information on the mansions come from, that there are things being condemned as sorcery, and sorcery is condemnable. So we want to remember that. But he says the mansions begin with the sun at the equinox, and the Picatrix says that they begin at 0 degrees Aries. So we're coming from the same time period. We're probably rooting into the vernal equinox as the beginning of the tropical zodiac. So the Picatrix, to the left, we have the John Michael Greer, Christopher Warnock, Renaissance Astrology, translated from the Latin. And to the right, we have the Ouroboros Press, translated from the Arabic by Hasham Attallah and Gallienne Holmquist, and edited by William Kiesel. So these are the two non-academic versions you can get, translated for astrologers, especially the Latin Picatrix, translated by astrologers. And so the Picatrix was composed in 1000 AD, and was, it calls itself, it gains the name Picatrix in the Latin translation, but it calls itself the Gayat al-Hakim, or the aim of the wise, or the aim of the sage, and was probably written in North Africa, maybe Spain, possibly Haran, or which is Upper Mesopotamia, modern day Turkey, kind of southeastern Anatolia. But either way, it was part of a current that flowed from Haran through North Africa to Spain, and is often attributed fashionably to the famed scholar Sufi al-Majariti, and to others, to other kind of sects of brethren, secret societies, other kind of mystics. People kind of would hang it on, like, well, maybe this mystic is the one who penned this or compiled this. It's lots of Indian rooted or influenced astrological concepts. And it's a really lengthy book for the era and genre. And it's the compiled knowledge from many books. I think within, it says over 200 books, and translated into Latin at the court of Alfonso the Wise of Castile in 1256. And one of many astro-magical alchemical translations to be done there. And it was a major influence from there on Marcello Ficino, Cornelius Agrippa, Elias Ashmole, William Lilly, and only recently, though, restored to prominence in the last couple of years. It's becoming really common to use it, which is a very recent phenomenon. And thanks to these people we just mentioned in the previous slide. It's Neoplatonic in philosophy and function, and Islamic theologically. So this is kind of the major point of this lecture that we'll kind of keep coming back to. But just to think about, here are some ideas. Where do they cut? Like, what's the worldview they come from? What else? How else were those people framing what was the world and what is right and wrong in the world? And from that perspective, how do they describe things? Like if you're at the gas station and one person gives you some information versus another random person, you kind of think like, okay, well, that's that guy saying that versus this person. So alchemical and cosmological treaty, then multiple similar treaties and astrological operations within. It's filled with magical characters, the effects of plants and stones and animal materia. And the mansions themselves are in two sections, kind of at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. In book 1, chapter 4, and in book 4, chapter 9. Book 1 is more electional, and some people just refer to it as the electional section, but throughout you'll see it will say, this is a good time for making images for X, Y, or Z. And that whole portion is attributed to Indian wisdom. So we might assume that that's coming from the Indian nakshatras, whereas book 4 is explicitly talismanic and magical and mentions materials to use, natural spells to follow, and some philosophy, which is followed by the barbarous names which call to the lords or the angels of the mansions. But it includes no real tech to call them, as later grimoires might, and is and that's kind of out of the paradigmatic scope of the author, as this starts to emerge that calling upon spirits is forbidden paradigmatically and has within the Picatrix an entirely mechanistic outlook of how to operate magic, that Neoplatonic functionality of the universe. And so this second section is attributed to Pliny. Thus, it's a Neoplatonist theurgical influence upon the talismanic tradition, as the Picatrix is really the centerpiece and the crown jewel of the talismanic tradition of astrological magic. And it's a keystone, and it's a treasure. And what I'm scrutinizing isn't its functionality or place as the primary astrological magical talismanic manual, but just looking at how they describe the mansions and what might their worldview be when they're describing the 28 places of the moon. So quick on Neoplatonism. The Picatrix name drops Aristotle throughout, as a lot of stuff, especially in Moorish Spain, does. And you know, we're pretty familiar with the planetary spheres. There's Earth, and then going up we have the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, then the fixed stars, and then here what Aristotle might say, the sphere of the prime mover, and that changes through Neoplatonic thought. Here's some more Neoplatonic breakdown, the declension of being. So up the top we have the one, the good, the God, you know, emanating from the sun, and all of the good coming from the top, emanating downwards through forms and the active intellect and the gods and the heavens. And then here's the sublunary realm, and then we're below that. We're kind of between souls and animal bodies. And then there's vegetables, inanimate matter, the elements, prime matter, and then non-being, nothingness, and evil. So we start to see this view of the world that up is good, down is bad. Here's another way to look at it, which goes into a little bit more explicit kind of geography. Here's more the kind of heavenly realm. I think it calls the eternal Empyrean paradise, then the layers we discussed, and then kind of the realm we exist in, purgatory, and then hell beneath. And so in that same time period where these ideas were coming together, this is what society looked like. So life, society, and culture in ancient Greece, a social pyramid. We have the government at the top, male citizens, and democracy, kind of government top, then regular male citizens, then male children, and then below that we had women, foreigners, and female children, and below that we had slaves. And there's text that we can continue that the only thing worse than slaves is the dead, which includes also your ancestors. And here are the guys that cooked that up. This is Plato and his disciples. Clearly we're looking at a bunch of, kind of like dudes in their 40s hanging around cooking up big ideas. And then here's an image from the same period, another mosaic of the Bacchanal. And something right away we notice is there's different kinds of people. There's also women, and there's also animals. And so when these bacchanals would take place in Dionysian festivals, women often outnumbered men. And these are reflections of pre-polis cultural customs, kind of like rural and pan pre-Indo-European customs that kind of still existed by the time Mycenaean Greece fell to Achaean Greece, and the fall of Troy. And then if you were to be a citizen, you were kind of a citizen of Athens, and you were a male, etc., and you could be in the government. But these earlier, more rural, outside of the polis, pre-polis, and colonial expressions of culture included more of the demographic of society. And they were, even when this got kind of brought into the Roman Dionysian initiation mystery traditions, they were even female led. And it was almost kind of like this Rotary Club vibe where aristocrat women would hold these Dionysian initiations, and they had special roles. So it's Dionysianism and these kind of outside of the polis cultures have female character typically, and they were suppressed heavily in 186 BC, as there was a lot of paranoia within the Senate. And they kind of did this thing that is almost like social distancing, where they were like, there can only be 50 people in a bacchanal. There has to be less women than men. And the traditions were really monitored. There was major book burnings at the same time of magical books. But within Dionysian traditions, there is like a mythological cosmogenesis, a lot of sublunar activity, ecstasis, the dead, beasts, animals. And so we'll come back to that later, but just kind of wanted to display how that looks as we start thinking about a text that's the only text that we use to describe the lunar mansions, coming from a worldview that might not be friendly to the entire demographic of the world. Here's some more Dionysian mosaic. So here we go. Some of the stuff within the Picatrix itself. Here's the first, second, and third lunar mansions. The names reflect mostly Arabic constellational descriptions and prominent fixed stars. So it's keyed into asterisms. It's, it starts at 0 degrees Aries. So it seems to be talking about like a tropical zodiac, but it's keying itself in the kind of Indian tradition into the stellar zodiac simultaneously, but into an Arabic paradigm. So there's maybe a little like pull two different directions of what it's trying to do. So the horns of Aries, 0 degrees Aries to 12 degrees and 51 minutes of Aries. And that's the length of all the lunar mansions in this system. 12 degrees and 51 minutes. And so we get the images, there's an image per mansion, as well as a name. It's a warrior with a spear. And then the election calls for journeys, medicine, beginnings, relationship, hostility, and discord. And the talisman is for destruction and depopulation. And then the details are you use an iron ring and black wax, and the name you would use is derives. And you can see as you go down that the next mansion goes from 12 to 25 Aries, and the one after that goes from 25 Aries to 8 Taurus. And that fit across a zodiacal sign is about 3 mansions per zodiacal sign, but then it overlaps into the next sign. So here's, moving forward from 8 Taurus to 21 Taurus, and then from 21 Taurus to 4 Gemini. And more of these details. And then here we go. And all these details are in the link that I showed you at the beginning that I'll show you again at the end, so you can kind of have these later. And here's something interesting that happens. The first mansion, the 8th mansion, the 15th, and the 22nd all land on 0 points. And these are the solstices and equinox points. The vernal equinox of 0 degrees Aries, the summer solstice of 0 degrees Cancer, the autumnal equinox of 0 degrees Libra, and the winter solstice of 0 degrees Capricorn. So it makes 4 groups of 7 mansions between the equinox and solstice points, the 4 points of notable light darkness within the cycle sections. And so here's the list itself. In the Picatrix, the Arabic lunar mansions, we get the horns of Aries, the little belly, many little ones, the follower, white spot, a mark, the forearm, the gap, the eyes, the brow, the mane, the changer, the wings, the unarmed, the covering, the claws, the crown, the heart, the sting, the beam, the city. And then from the city, from the 21st lunar mansion, things get weird. Then we get into the lucky one of the slaughterers, the luckiest of the lucky star of hidden things, the fore spout of the water bucket, the lower spout of the water bucket, and then the belly of fish. So we'll want to remember that. We'll come back to that. But after the 21st lunar mansion, which is when we get the last final 7, something very different happens. And so that would be 0 degrees Capricorn to 0 degrees Aries, the final cyclical section. And so you can group these into auspicious mansions and inauspicious mansions. So if we look at the auspicious mansions, we could say, oh, well, what are good mansions for taking medicine? Well, the 1st, 14th, 22nd, and 23rd are good for taking medicine. Or what's good for finding treasure? Oh, the 2nd, 14th, and 18th lunar mansions are great for finding treasure in the electional section, in the first section of the Picatrix. So the inauspicious mansions, you're like, oh, what's terrible for crops and trees? Oh, the 6th, 14th, and 16th lunar mansions. What about harvest? When's a really bad time for harvest? Oh, the 9th, 14th, and 16th. But we notice some weird patterns when we do this, that there seems to be malevolent and benevolent lunar mansions entirely. The most notable being the 9th lunar mansion is on the 2nd list 3 times, but is not on the 1st list at all. So it seems to be pretty much all bad and not good. The 15th lunar mansion is on the 2nd list twice and not on the 1st list at all. So it also seems to be all bad and not good. And then when we look at the, this is from the talismanic groupings, we see some of the information, but there's some differences. This time we get the 15th lunar mansion, which was inauspicious in the 1st list, is being utilized here once for wealth and once for relationships. And the 9th is still not used at all. Perhaps the culture of the Picatrix saw no use for it rather than it being inherently negative. Although when we start to look at other data that we can compare to this and other forms of lists that are 28 lists across culture, we'll see that the ninth lunar mansion might correspond to Astarte and the Whore of Babylon and the serpent in the Garden of Eden and Inanna Ishtar. And so this might be a call that this kind of nature was a no-go. And we see that with the 15th lunar mansion as well, that it's mostly bad in what the Picatrix has it described for, but across culture, it's also tends to fall into categories where it's explicitly female spirits and Venusian significations. So image magic and talismans, we're going to kind of breeze through here. So image magic and talisman this is theurgy. So there's we're going through levels of the celestial spheres to the divine unity above all, and then we're calling that power back down and kind of pushing down the specific sphere that we've selected and picked out a time for. When we looked at the celestial spheres before and all of those kind of like up-down constructions of the universe, this differed from Orphic and other worldviews outside of the polis, and also previous to Plato. And so, with such as like the Orphic transmigration ideas of reincarnation, where Hades was navigatable, where you could kind of go in and either go to Elysium or Tartarus or loop back into a new body in life and become a different being. These are different kinds of cyclical and horizontal ideas, separate from those like up-down hierarchical spherical ideas. And so the current magical paradigm that we're all sort of in tends to be more animist, and the whole world and even governments are becoming more animist now. And so we kind of want to look at the technologies of Neoplatonic theurgy and how they're usable, the way that science is usable, but science isn't reality. Science is a technique within reality that we can get results. Also, Neoplatonic theurgy is a technique within reality that we can get results, but it maybe isn't reality itself. So although the earliest Hermetic thought could be considered animist in that it considered matter to be animated, but when we're doing image magic, we're basically like this, there's the spirit ascending, our spirit ascending up the spheres and calling to the powers of the divine unity above, and the incense is going up while the candle is burning down, and we're calling up to God, and the virtue of the planet or whatever sphere we've selected is coming down. And so the theurgical magician is trafficking up and down through the spheres and mediating between higher and more divine consciousness. The Picatrix primarily uses image magic, but also natural magic is employed throughout, like sympathy and the doctrine of signatures and similitude with lapidary and herbal correspondence and animal correspondence. Natural magic replaces image magic sort of by the Renaissance, and then gets wrapped up into like Christian influences, Judeo-Christian paradigm, which prohibits magic done by spirits, which we already see happening in the Picatrix as it being theologically Islamic. And so theurgy itself, here's a theurgist. We can see that he's, this is Hermes Trismegistus, a depiction of him, and he's spinning the kind of these, the spheres within the spheres upon his finger because he knows what to do. Proclus in 480 says theurgy is a power higher than all human wisdom, embracing the blessings of divination and purifying powers of initiation, and in a word, all the operations of divine possession. So being possessed by the divine. Spiritual magic or theurgy was based on the idea that one could reach God in an ascent up the scale of creation made possible by rigorous course of prayer, fasting, and devotional preparation. And so, yeah, basically this is priestly and upper literate kind of stuff that we're talking about here. And so image magic is theurgical and talismanic. Monastic mysticism might be more meditation and prayer. Natural magic, more herbal and lapidary. Low magic and folk magic or village magic might be more herbal, but then you start to get stuff with like saints, relics, and superstition. Like if this touches that, the virtue can be transmitted and contagion can occur of a virtue. And then necromancy is spirit invocation and evocation, directly interacting with entities that inhabit the sky or the elements or a place or the underworld. Astrological magic throughout its entire tradition is sort of like all of the above at different times, depending on what book we look in. It just uses a lot more timing, a lot more specific timing. So in the Picatrix itself, when we're going to do a lunar mansion talisman, we have some protocols. Mostly we want the moon to be free of malefics, and we want the moon to not be combust and not be applying to an eclipse, not be with the nodes, especially the south node. We want it to make soft aspects to benefics, and if we can, separating from one fortune and applying to another, from Venus to Jupiter, say. And on the ascendant, or there's also good argument now for that being on the midheaven instead. And then below that, we have a bunch of kind of fine tuning considerations, because you can always fine tune an election more and more. It would be better if we could avoid the via combusta. It would be better, yada, yada, yada. But basically the top text in red is kind of the basics of how we're going to make a lunar mansion election for a talisman, or for an election or a talisman. But if we're going to do talismans, we want to like maybe consider some other things that the Picatrix does not mention, like is the moon full and filling with light? And then we can start to think about all other stuff, you know, because we're participating in the tradition. We can kind of say, well, what about this? What about this? And that's where we become experimenting, you know, with the art. For the construction, you know, we're basically like choosing our celestial power, choosing our conjuration, what incense matches, what images matches, and figures and materials through significations of the planets. And then we're going to pick our time, what our intention is, what our ceremony is. Then we're going to create an atmosphere and a vibe. And then we're going to kind of import some of our own magical tech, you know, just how we ceremony. Materials are suggested in the Picatrix. It tells you what to use. Some of them are just too absurd to get, or involve animals you're not going to kill. But generally, if we're going lunar, we can do silver. A lot of people use paper. You could try quartz or moonstone or wax or clay or wood from a lunar place, or glass. But yeah, we're just going with similitude and sympathy. You can look at on the Renaissance Astrology website where all of Lily's stuff is mentioned. And that's basically how that's done. And so that's all in the Picatrix, and you can kind of go in there and totally experiment with that. So then from there, the mansions throughout history, we pretty much get an exact echo of what the Picatrix says in Cornelius Agrippa's treaty on the mansions. It's pretty much the exact same thing. And then with just some variations, like a game of telephone. We also see similar stuff show up in Elias Ashmole's material, but he starts including things like washing and cutting your hair, or buying clothes, or temperamental or humoral theory as magical and astrological material gets democratized and starts to be in the hands of guys like this guy, you know, like lawyers and doctors and book collectors and things like that. And then this later, after printing presses start, the sanctions come off printing presses, and we start to see kitchen physic in the hands of peasants. Then this pours into the almanac tradition, and we see similar information, not remembering its source in the farmers' almanacs of today. And that's kind of leaves us with the Chinese and Indian nakshatras, or lunar mansions, which in Indian astrology are the nakshatras, which means that which never decays, referring to stars. So there's different starting points historically, but usually opposite Spica. And the zodiac and the nakshatras begin at the same point. It's typical to list 27 nakshatras, but I read this in Freedom Cole's book. He mentions that there's 28 nakshatras in an older division of the nakshatras, and then there's, I can't remember if this came from him or elsewhere, but that changed when there was a change in calendar systems, because the Indians were using 30-day months and 360-day sidereal years rather than tropical years. And at one point, there was a change in calendrical systems, which caused them to say it would be more effective to have this be 27 nakshatras, to stick with a sidereal zodiac while they moved into a tropical year when they gained a lunar solar calendar cycle. But the older 28 division system is still used in India for when the question is specifically about something with the more spiritual purpose, whereas the 27 nakshatras are used for more mundane purposes. And that's really interesting to note, that there might be something ideal about the 28, as like it's the cycle of light and darkness, not because it's tropical, because it's seasonal, but it's the idealized ecliptic. It's more esoteric than the sidereal that roots directly into stars, which might be what the Picatrix is doing, sort of doing more of like a stellar grouping magic, more so than a lunar zodiacal magic. So, and the nakshatras were thought to be the daughters of Daksha Prajapati. His name means able or dexterous or honest one. And he was kind of like a cosmic progenitor, specially charged by Brahma to assist the cosmic evolutionary process. And so we start to see parallels here to the Orphic Theogony that we can kind of continue with. And that's like where a lot of the search ends up going in later phases, is you're like, oh, okay, there's this cosmogenesis mythos that surrounds the nakshatras that we can find some evidence for, that might surround how people were thinking also about a lunar zodiac in the Mediterranean world. And so in the Orphic Theogony, we get Uranos and Gaia begetting Zeus, and then Zeus begets everyone and also becomes Phanes, and then swallows everything again, and then gives birth to it as the cosmic egg. And then out of that comes the Dionysian episodes, and Dionysus being torn apart by the Titans, and then it starts to fractal and become multidimensional. And we see similar stuff in what surrounds the cosmogenetic kind of mythos of the nakshatras. There's within that, in the Indian system, there's Prakriti, who's the female creative impulse that sustains the background of the zodiac. And that's a really similar role to Hecate's role in the Chaldean oracles, where she's kind of like, there's Zeus, Ao, and Hecate is kind of the black void behind everything, from which light and epiphany emerges. And so if it's where light emerges from the void of darkness, that's basically like space and the stars and the celestial bodies. And then she's married, Prakriti then is married to Chandra, the moon god. And then from there we get all of the nakshatras. And so the nakshatras come from the Vedanga Jyotisha, a text dated about 2347 BC, which far predates Hellenistic astrology. So we know that there's, lunar mansion or lunar, zodiacal type calendars go even further back into like maybe even like 30,000 years ago, and of various forms, but in like an actual kind of tradition of lunar mansion type 28 places, definitely 2347 BC is way before the astrology that we currently use as the Hellenistic tradition. They each have a presiding deity, a ruling planet, a symbolic form, an animal type, a direction, a temperament, extensive correspondences, whether it's a god, a man, a demon, whether it's male or female, east, south, west, north. And the nakshatras also are the domiciles for certain devatas, or kinds of deities, that we might have lost that in the Mediterranean world as we moved out of polytheism, and may have disrupted our grasp on the mansions and the Orphic cosmogenitive model, which might have fit with it. And so there are many similarities to the Picatrix list names, especially at the end, dealing with fame and wealth and earlier or later types of auspiciousness, and the water spouts of the Arabic mentions being resource flow, like higher and lower flow of resources. The nakshatras are said to have a deeper effect than the zodiac signs. And that's interesting as well. The signs are thought of to be as qualitative and quantitative of material resources, whereas the nakshatras are quantitative and qualitative of mental and emotional resources. I don't have a lot prepared on the Chinese mentions, but I will say that they also are structured into 4 sevens, 28 mansions into 4 sevens, and they are those 4 sets of 7 are presided over by 4 mysterious animals, and they correspond to directions and seasons and elements and qualities, and also begin with Spica. But this kind of, we'll see reflections of animals and mystery as we go forward.
I have a
So that's
couple. I have a couple of questions here. I don't know if you want to answer them
perfect.
out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Grant was asking, when you were talking about the Picatrix, he was asking, what's your definition for spirit contact, since Picatrix has multiple options for contacting spirits?
I was mostly pointing to that, like, there's not it's lacking in a kind of a kind of approach and call. Like, there's calls throughout, or there's names throughout, but not a lot of information on exactly how you would call that spirit and how you would interact with it. It's more heavy on just naming intelligences and angels.
And then Connor asked if you have any recommendation for books on the Orphic tradition.
I can not necessarily off the top of my head, but I can send those out to people later. I have everyone's email.
And then Jason is asking, how much overlap do you see between these Lunar Mansion image and Deccan image? He got here late, so no, we haven't touched on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be overlap, especially because the Picatrix is tending to look at the stars themselves, and they seem to kind of root things into a tropical zodiac observance, probably coming from the Greek influences, but then
I forgot I signed up for another workshop that was like right after the workshop that just ended.
Are also from the sorry, there's a, let me regroup here. Yeah, so they're looking at the stars, even though the Picatrix is kind of talking about starting at 0 degrees Aries, and it seems like it's organized around the solstice and equinox cycle. The way they frame the names for everything links into asterisms, and it seems that they're describing the images that also probably were congruent with just stellar images in general. So both decans and the Arabic lunar mansions are both kind of like talking about the images that they see in stars and kind of from stories of stars.
Okay, that's it for questions. Now I'm gonna just keep taking them and interrupt you later.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so here's an image of Mercury in the underworld, Hermes in the underworld, and so groping for more after we kind of run out of things to look at. Where do we go from here? You know, where can we find more to fill in the 28 places? And so from our own lived experience, I would say, from kind of looking into the visual stellar layer that we see and feeling the tropical zodiac in directionality and in cardinal directions and in actual space, like really trying to get used to the eastern horizon being the ascendant, looking to the south and up, and feeling the midheaven there, and looking to the west and feeling the descendant and looking to the north and down, and at least at this part of the world in the northern hemisphere, and seeing the IC and kind of just rooting yourself into that, and then watching the visual stellar layer go by and where the moon is there, and then like kind of keeping track of a feel for that tropical light darkness cycle that's remembered by the moon, and just feeling how that affects you or how you interact with that over time. That's definitely the first place to go. But then when we're looking for the mentions elsewhere and other kinds of magic, we can become motivated to look into contemporaneous and interrelated cultures to the Hellenistic crucible, which begot the astrology we mostly use. So anything that's astrological, we think of astrological magic as talismanic magic, but there's a lot of different other magics in the various grimoire traditions that are all totally loaded with astrology. And so if we go back through textual history, we might want to go to the apocryphal Wisdom of Solomon in 220 to 250 BC, and who prays to a spirit of wisdom and is taught both astrology and spirit coercion in one go. And so that we see that like married together in that moment of astrology and spirit interaction being kind of one thing. You know, that's, he was like, I want wisdom, and he got astrology and spirit interaction technology. Then the Testament of Solomon in the 1st to 3rd century CE, maybe written in Alexandria. We see allegories of the building of Solomon's temple being disrupted by a demon, and Solomon binds the demon, and then from that demon he can call upon a bunch of other demons that come in. The first that he deals with are a demon per decon, and they all are keyed into ailments in the human body and maladies of different human body parts, which is like common in Egypt, like the human body kind of distributed into the stars and into the sky. Then we can see in the Hygromantia in the 6th to 11th century, or in the Heptameron in the 14th century, and basically all other grimoires, there's a widely and holy astro/spirit kind of thema going on, where there's day and hour planetary timings, there's planetary prayers, there's planetary correspondences throughout, but they're way more heavy on relying on the interaction and relationship and engagement with the spirit doing the magic, rather than the material or the image being the mechanism which does the magic. And so we'd probably have way more to say about that, and there'd be way more obviousness to that whole interrelation of an inhabited sky, but there was major suppression throughout various periods. In that same year where I was talking about the major suppressions of Dionysian bacchanals, 186 BC, there was massive Roman book burnings of all books of soothsaying, including astrology. There's 5 years earlier, they were even burning Pythagoras's work. He's known as a mathematician, but wrote heavily on early Hermetic and magical. In the Bible, in Acts 19, in the New Testament, there's recorded the burning of books equal to 50,000 silver pieces, which we don't know what that means as far as currency, but that's a robust magical practice that they're describing. A lot of people practicing magic. The Emperor Augustus ordered 2,000 magical scrolls burned in his time. In the 4th century, there was a giant magical book roundup in Constantinople. In the 12th century, in the Inquisition, books of Solomon were ordered burned by Pope Innocent IV in 1350. And the Grand Inquisitor Emmerich in the mid-1300s burned also hundreds of grimoires. And in Venice in 1573, they had confiscated so many books of magic and so many grimoires in particular, that they had so many warehouses filled with these books that they were just starting to burn them because they had nowhere else to put them. And so the amount of people doing magic and the amount of literature on magic that we would have had to have a full idea of this is mostly lost to us, but there's basically a lot of contemporaneous astrology references in magical traditions adjacent to the Hellenic world, such as the Greek magical papyri. So for the most part, this was composed, a large section of it at least, by a single scribe in one scribal workshop in Thebes, and probably compiled between 200 and 400 AD. But the window on the content of spells of which it reflects probably is more likely brought into the 4th century BC to the 5th century CE as kind of a collection of what kind of material. It's written mostly in Greek and some in Demotic and a little bit in Coptic. And it's the magic of laid off temple priests initiated into mystery schools and employed by hereditary appointment to inspiriting statues. So like the statue of Hermanubis in the Vatican, it would be these people that them and then their ancestors before them were the ones employed to make sure that the statue of Hermanubis actually had Hermanubis seated within it, rather than it just being a representation of Hermanubis. And they worked in the temples in states of ritual purity for 3 months per year, and then hit the streets looking for magical side work and just living their life. So once they weren't working at the temples, they were instead filling statues and gems and tablets and amulets in the street for people who were contracting them to do sorcery for them. Much of this material was split apart and distributed all over the world and was recovered at Peaks Market in the mid-1800s. And I think I don't know if it ever has been all brought back together in one place since, except for in translation. But within we find spirit, daemon, and deity bullying being really big, pushing around gods, and magic with materials, barbarous names, like abracadabra, famously coming from one of the wing diagrams. Within wing diagrams are like when you get like the whole word abracadabra, but then reducing down to an A at the bottom. There's a lot of stuff like charms like that in there. Invocations, evocations, dream sending, talismans, amulets, statues, love spells, curses, divination, exorcism, necromancy, healing, astrological observances and timed or access magics, stellar timings, mixes of Egyptian, Greek, and Judeo-Babylonian magical elements. So it's like a real counter-cultural confluence of various people's magic and languages. And it's a major source of the grimoire tradition and Western magic as we know it. And kind of just like a damn good read. It's really funny. But also, it's not like the uber source, but it's it is a representation of a lot of magic that a lot of different people are doing, kind of in a similar place as where astrology came together, kind of like the next town over, that we can look at for a lot of cross-cultural information. As we were saying, a lot of it was lost to suppression and book burnings. And there's a lot of astrology in there, kind of peppered throughout. There's a Pythagoras dream oracle, which references the zodiac and the Pleiades. There's lunar solar timing throughout the whole piece. What we're looking at this slide are astrological characters from the PGM. What magics to perform when the moon is in which zodiac sign. There's multiple pieces on that. There's stuff on the lunar days. There's stuff on the stations of the sun, like sunrise, noon, sunset, midnight. It talks about the headless rite being directed towards Orion. There's a whole piece about working to override your birth chart so you're not subject to it anymore and you're free from its fate. There's stuff about vowels as directions and with elemental correspondences, kind of like Iamblichus's planet sounds, which now we know, like there's NASA data that the planets all make sounds. And so the PGM is relevant to astrologers as the Hellenized world developed in and around Alexandria while the culture of the PGM seems to be in full swing in its myths. The earliest surviving natal horoscope is from the 1st century BC, so kind of right in that time, right in the middle of that time period of spells of street magic from the next town over, from Alexandria, which was Thebes, which Thebes is kind of like the old culture of Egypt, whereas Alexandria was the new, more metropolitan trading center. But there's overlap between Claudius Ptolemy, the Greek ethnic Egyptian, and Alexander, who's working at the Alexandrian Library and wrote Tetrabiblos. He might have been privy to some of this street magic that was going on. Vettius Valens had a school in Alexandria around the time of the PGM compilation. And then, Apuleius, who wrote The Golden Ass, was from the same time period, and within has some PGM sounding type magic at the crux of his story. It's The Golden Ass is kind of like written like a novel that mentioned, and within the novel, it mentions horoscopic astrology and philosophical debates of fate. And we see some kind of like PGM type animal transformation, which changes the main character into a donkey as he's trying to turn into an owl. And then the whole story ensues. And then at the end, he has to kind of like pray to the goddess to be turned back into a human. And then he gets further initiated into the mysteries of Isis. We'll come back to that later. But there's other relevant characters within deep astrology that were interrelated with the kinds of magic that intersected with what we see in the PGM. So it's old style magic of like kind of boss and bullying, kind of getting on top of deities often and trying to push them around, saying, do this or I will destroy the whole universe and you with it. And one of the most prominent characters within the pages is Hecate. I think she's maybe the deity mentioned the most times, and she's kind of like, as a goddess of magic and witchcraft, is kind of the patroness of this type of witchcraft or this type of magic. She's a very old deity, like very possibly or almost definitely pre-Greek. Literary sources confirm her worship in the 5th century BC in Athens, but her cult spread around the Aegean in the 6th century BC. The first literary mention is in Homer's Odyssey, then Hesiod's Theogony in the 8th century BC, but connections to her cults and names and goddesses earlier and outside of the Greek sphere kind of spread out, just like her symbol. If you just look at her cult symbols, they just spread out into deeper antiquity and prehistory. Hesiod has Hecate born of Asteria and Persis. Asteria was the goddess of the night sky. So she was the goddess of astrology and prophetic dreams as well. Both things that we see in the PGM. And Persis means destroyer. And it was often, Herodotus says that the Persians were named after Persis, the son of Perseus. So we see feedback already, even before Al-Biruni, between cultures which might have been using 28 place type zodiacal, lunar zodiacal systems already happening. Alternate parentage of Hecate from Homeric and Orphic hymns relates her to various things like the underworld and herbal drugs and the darkness of the sky and Zeus as the progenitor, and connecting underworld and sky and the afterlife and ideas of transmigration, which again we see her followers were often believed in reincarnation, were vegetarian. So more of these parallels to the cultural kind of cultural, like, what am I trying to say, like petri dish from which came the nakshatras and Indian type traditions. There was syncretism and associations and assimilations with Hecate with various deities like Selene and Artemis and the moon, Zeus, Jupiter, Helios and Apollo, the sun, Hermes, Mercury, Kronos, and Saturn. And then with Venus through necessity and the fates. So maybe more aggressive forms of Venus, which might be about like earlier forms of Venus, like pre-Aphrodite. So so she was basically syncretized to every planetary deity, and one of her mothers was a goddess of this night sky and astrology itself. And so she's a goddess of darkness and the moon and the sky and progenation. of gates and ways, minality and torches and crossroads, graves, children, childbirth, ports, dogs, lions and gates and beasts, generally animals, primordial darkness, and the moon in all its phases, especially the dark moon. And some of her notable devotees were Hesiod, Empedocles, from where we get the 4 elements, Porphyry of Tyre, where we get the Porphyry house system, and she was integral to the Eleusinian mystery traditions inside the collective practices of the time. So a lot of the astrologers we read from the Hellenistic tradition may have been either initiated into mysteries she was related to, or definitely privy to her worship. And she takes a very important role, as I noted before, in the Chaldean oracles as well. And so some of the ideas I'm going to go into next, I noticed through looking through the works of Jake Stratton Kent. And if you are into the stuff we're talking about, you might want to look into his Geosophia and the Testament of Cyprian the Mage, and his other work. So he noted that there in the PGM, there's a list of mostly animals in a prayer to Mene, the goddess of months, where they call upon the 28 shapes of the world. This is PGM V11 756 to 94, and so there's that's kind of a Hecate cosmogenesis, where she's called upon from the new moon to the full moon in 14 sounds, and then there's a list of 28 things. The first 21 are animals. Think about how she distributes breath and life to everything in the material and manifest world. And this is from a text that was composed in Thebes and sounds really similar to the Theban cult deity Khonsu, who was the lunar child of Amun and Mut, and was the god particularly associated with the new moon, just like Hecate. So there's this kind of like these Theban type ideas of how things become animated. And then we see in the mosaic here, this is Orpheus surrounded by animals. As we're starting to look into like 28 animals, like in lunar animals and traditions that that have something that looks like a lunar zodiac of animal forms. But the first 28 first 21, I'm sorry, are animals in this prayer to Mene, who's a goddess of months. But the next 7 are cult objects of Hecate. So Jake goes into another an adjacent spell, the document to the waning moon, and pulls out 7 more animals, as it mentions, along with the same list of cult symbols mentioned in the first list. A further list of animals that are all female that he overlays. The switch from animals to objects around the same time, as in the Picatrix list, from the anthropomorphic and human animal names to situations and obscure objects and concepts, like how we see at the bottom of the Picatrix list. It goes into kind of the lower water spout, the higher water spout, and it gets kind of strange. This happens at the same part that switches from animals to cult objects of Hecate at the last 7 objects in the list. But it's possible that the animal mentions were used for timing in the PGM, if this is a list of 28 lunar zodiacal places, as there's things like in PGM XXXV1, there's a charm of a scarab. So you might use the scarab mansion when you time such operation. And so if you look at this and go back through the PGM, it might be a key to lunar zodiacal timing for spells that center around certain animals. But seeing animals in the sky and the stars is very, very old. And we start getting into earlier traditions of primal nature and dance and indigenous art and shamanic practices with animal spirits. And the moon being related to animals in the corruptible world and the sublunar realm, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the animal list with the cult objects at the end, and to one side overlaid with Jake's suggestion of the last 7 female animals from the adjacent spell. But on the left side, it's the what is listed as the cult objects of Hecate from the prayer to Mene. So we get ox, vulture, bull, scarab, falcon, crab, he-dog, he-wolf, serpent, horse, she-goat, asp, kid-goat, he-goat, baboon, cat, lion, leopard, mouse, deer. This is often translated as dragoness and sometimes as multiform. And then virgin, torch, lightning, garland, herald's wand, child, and key. I think it's totally fair to use the animals that of Jake's suggestion as they are related to Hecate and this whole invocation system is. And if you want to go with a fully rounded out and like lunar animal zodiacal cycle, I think it's perfectly appropriate for them to be sort of guides to enter those spaces, and you can kind of play around with them. Or you could just stick with the textual tradition and just observe the cult symbols of Hecate on the lower end of the list. But note that like from 20 down, basically from 21 down, the last 7 objects are, it widens out the beginning of the list, or makes the end of the list, or makes it strange. And then the same, here's the Picatrix list again. Just right off the bat, you can see from 21 down, that same strangeness occur from the city onward. And then these are the nakshatra names. It's less obvious, but you can see that from the same basic section down, where you get the earlier victory, the later victory, the famous, the most famous, has 100 medicines, the earlier auspicious one, the later auspicious one. Similar language to the Picatrix, and it also spreads out at the bottom. These are various images of the nakshatras, like the image that would be mentioned along with the names. And right away you can see that the same thing happens at the bottom of the list. It gets more obscure, more complicated. There's more things listed. There are weirder things. We also can see, I have to go back, here's the animal list, the 9th lunar mansion, or the 9th lunar zodiacal place in the PGM is serpent. And then in the nakshatras, the 9th place is also serpent. So, and I'm not going to go into them all right now, but we've been collecting a lot of correspondences that continues to point that the PGM list is certainly a lunar zodiacal list. I don't want to say a lunar mansion list, because I'm not talking anymore about, I'm going to call the Indian nakshatras nakshatras. I'm going to call the Arabic lunar mansions mansions, and I'm going to call the PGM list just 28 animals or 28 lunar zodiacal places. They're all valid within their own tradition, but the combination of all of them helps us get a better idea of what the sky territories in general might look like. And so in each example, the list gets more complex, more specific, and more obscure from 21 on, which in tropical lists is from 0 degrees Capricorn. In the Picatrix, that's the city. And also in the PGM, that's dragoness and multiform. It's also where we get the cult things begin in the PGM, and where the shift to the female gender specificity is if we do the Stratton Kent overlay. This is where the moon hits her detriment at 0 degrees Capricorn, or exile. So that's an interesting thing to note, as we're starting to see layers of the PGM stuff might be relating to mystery traditions. And so the West has no necessarily lunar mansion, or the Mediterranean West has no lunar mansion tradition on its own, because possibly they got deposited into mystery traditions. And the meeting of cult things in Hecate and the moon going into her exile into the degree of detriment at the gate of the gods. In Mithraism, 0 degrees Cancer was where souls ingress into the world, and 0 degrees Capricorn is where they egress out of the world. And so there's a gateway between the worlds at this degree. And it's at winter solstice when things move inside for the weather, and that we get this initiation into the hidden things in the Turanian mystery traditions of death and rebirth from winter into spring. It's also, if you think in Dionysian traditions, the bull, which is a major symbol of Hecate and of Dionysus, was the bull and the minotaur and the labyrinth were kind of allusions to things that would happen within the Dionysian mystery rites. And so then this is Capricorn, the tomb and the temple. And so Orphic cosmogenesis and reincarnation, with like Zeus in the cave where he was hidden from Kronos and suckled by the goat, so it could be the goat of Capricorn, the hard womb of Saturn. And also, but it's a sea goat, so it's a lunar goat. And so there could be a goddess hidden in there where we hit the PGM female animal specificity in female earth sign through the dragoness and the city and the multiform. So as we gain complexity, we gain the cult objects and the obscure, mysterious bottom of all these lists. And the final mansion seasonal quadrant, where we consider generally the mysterious animals in the Chinese tradition, and the mentions in general being deeper than the zodiac signs in the Indian tradition, and also the 28 system being more spiritual than the 27 system, suggesting that there are mysteries within the lunar zodiac within itself, and possibly mysteries that can only be learned through experience rather than textual evidence or textual transmission, learning by having a teacher and reading a text and being taught, but by experiencing initiation rites. We see in the Golden Ass by Apuleius that there is a botched animal transformation remediated finally by eating roses, symbols of the goddess, and a prayer to the goddess and the moon at the sea, then further mystery tradition initiation and devotion, kind of a 1 year cycles within the whole, going back to the moon, remembering the cycle of the sun, and the mansion's spiraling solstitial gates as the plot revolves around female power engagement experiences. If we're talking about a dragon and a city and a multiform nature and animals, we can also look at revelations as we're going back to how the Picatrix looks at the 9th lunar mansion and the serpent as being all negative. In Revelations, we see how Babylon is both a tower and a city and a dragon and a beast and a ritual love goddess of civic pride. The Tower of Babel is the axis mundi for sacred sex, and originating with traditions of Inanna Ishtar, who is herself considered a daughter of the moon, and her father was also the moon god, and she wears a horned crown, symbols of the moon, similar to Hecate's, as her sister was a Rishkagel, who is probably the Sumerian Hecate, and Inanna being the almost more Aphrodite-like. She wears lapis jewels, which represent the night sky, and a rainbow necklace of the planets, and also water and sunlight, similar to like water in the moon receiving the solar light and fire, as the zodiac itself was described in Sumerian tradition as Ishtar's girdle. So these kind of like Erishkigal and her sister, and Hecate and Aphrodite being kind of wrapped up into lunar significations and female mysteries and lunar astrology and the non-polis chthonic practices, and the mansions themselves going underground for various reasons as the transition into urbanization and Roman imperial and later Christianity. As we're talking about the suppression in 186 of Dionysian traditions in Bacchanal and anti-magic paranoia of the Romans. And so looking back through the Neoplatonism and religious hierarchy and anti-magic paranoia, like Hecate is daughter of Asteria and Ishtar is the daughter of the moon. We can see in even other texts, generative paradox that keeps coming up of who's mother, and in the nakshatras itself, like it's like, oh, this was the cosmogenesis of everything, and Hecate breathing the life into all forms. Even in the Nag Hammadi scriptures, we get the poem Thunder Perfect Intellect, which might be a reflection of Inanna type archetypes and Babylon type archetypes, saying I'm the mother and the daughter, and all of these kind of paradoxical generative things. So both mistress of beasts and gates and intertwining aspects of the goddess, cross-culture and cosmogenetic formula with variant foci. So yeah, just kind of wrapping up a lot of the ideas and themes that keep coming up as we dive further into like where we might find some more correspondences of 28 places. Should I pause for questions?
There's one question from Vanessa, but I think you're going into it now, so I'll just she's just asking about Quimbanda, but you're going into it now, so.
Okay, yep, totally.
Okay.
Okay, so Ars Goetia is maybe what we think of when we hear the word Goetia, the Lesser Key of Solomon. And this is the portion of grimoires where we think of like the tools and the rules and the invocations and evocations and spirit lists, and later with seals, but first just with names. Goetia comes from what like words like goes, which means professional mourner, howler, wailer, from archaic Greece, from again Greek, non-polis, colonial death customs persistent into early Christian times, which mixed with Orphic traditions and what transformed into certain magical practices. So this is like the people who dealt with the dead and would guide them into the afterlife and kept them from messing about in the community. So, but Goetia, like originally meaning just like sort of people who had this kind of shamanic role of dealing with spirits within the community and with people who died, being eventually meaning sorcery and divination via spirits as theurgy developed, as Neoplatonism started to develop, as things became more urbanized. Theurgy was magic accomplished through celestial and angelic contact, whereas Goetia was divination and sorcery, often slanderized, that was via spirits. So Goetia was done in the sublunar realm entirely, the earth, the underworld, which includes our sky, but doesn't need to go above what we physically see and experience. It's not calling upon the planetary spheres and the fixed stars exactly, but we'll get into like how it interacts with the stars in a little bit. So going further into like what is Goetia, where in Goetia are we looking? The Testament of Solomon mentions 36 spirits per one per decon, and then the later Ars Goetia famously has 72 spirits, which could easily be 36 twice. But the mansions might be possibly found later in what are referred to as more diabolical grimoires that don't require angels or God or an authority of heavenly authority, but work instead with the spirit hierarchy directly. So they're called diabolical because they're not as concerned with what God thinks about the whole operation, but it's just working within the sublunar list itself. And so the text that we're talking about mostly is the Grimorium Verum, and it's kind of contemporary text and its ancestor text, but we're going to center it around the Grimorium Verum. There's French and Italian manuscripts, likely from the 18th century in its current form, but interestingly, it claims lineage to 1517, which was doubted for a long time, and it was thought to be a farcical text, but most recently, it has been collected in an ancestor text has been translated and collected that dates back plausibly between 1559 and 1636. And the Grimorium Verum claims to be authored by Alabek the Egyptian of Memphis, who purportedly wrote it in 1517, which is likely fictional, but that's still really interesting that and intriguing that it references an Egyptian, and we're comparing its structure in part to a structure originating in Thebes. So what was thought to be just kind of a fictional story to make it seem magical or old might actually be in reference to that it's sublunary and it's mansion timed, and it might have originated from something like the PGM list, or from a tradition that was timing regular street magic rather than theurgical ceremonial magic by lunar mansions or lunar zodiacal places. So Deconic spirits focus in on the ascendant and on the east and on cardinal directions. So they're more horizontal, as displayed in the air triplicity glyphs being horizontal, whereas timing and instructions in the Grimorium Verum talk about using the third planetary hour of night, which is the planetary ruler of the day. They talk about doing stuff when the moon is crescent, and they talk about locating the highest star in the sky. All of these seem to suggest more of a concern with the midheaven and with the stars and the moon out together and visible while the sun has descended into the underworld. So a more like visible experience of the sky and how you interact with the moon. And so I started taking some of these ideas and making spreadsheets. This is just an example of some names on a spreadsheet, but basically the first column is the Picatrix names. The second column is the spirits from the Grimorium Verum. The third is the PGM list, and then the final one are the issue of Kumbanda, which the Grimorium Verum was a grimoire in particular that went across when Brazil was colonized and entered into a confluence of African traditional religion, indigenous Brazilian religion, and Iberian witchcraft and grimoire magic that kind of came together to be the New World tradition of Kimbanda, and the persona within Kimbanda even shares the same, visibly, the seals of the spirits from the Grimorium Verum. So sometimes what they elaborate upon those persona can be useful to look at, especially in a case like this, where you're just looking for more information about the persona that relates to 20 places of sky territory. Jake Stratton-Kent points out a certain 18-ness that's common in some later grimoires, and it's most explicit in the Grimorium Verum, where we have 3 chiefs, 2 deputies beneath each of them, an intermediary spirit, and then 18 spirits that you can call upon beneath that, and that equals 28 persona total. So you can overlay that persona over the PGM list, and then see if you have ways of calling upon these spirits rooted into sublunar and lunar zodiacal timing. So I started laying all the stuff back side to side, what the spirits of the Grimorium Verum are supposed to be able to do, what elections are possible within the Picatrix, and what the talismans in the Picatrix do, what the Kimbanda Eshu are known for, and which animal falls upon from the PGM on that place, and then what kinds of mythologies from classical mythology, but especially from Dionysian and Hecatean and these kind of outsider foreigner deity type rural, older pre-Bronze Age colonial type mytho-cosmogenetic magical animal mythologies, and then when you put all of that side by side, some really explicit and striking and interesting stuff starts to come up, and really, it's really amazing how sometimes a really prominent correspondence that's lost in the Grimorium Verum list comparing to the Picatrix ends up being found all the way over in the Kimbanda list. So just because it's the same persona from this grimoire from penned in the like 1700s in France, and then traveling to Brazil, there's stuff about that persona, that issue, that seems to relate all the way back to the Picatrix. And so that's really interesting. So here's how some of this correspondence looks. Here's the 20th lunar mansion. In the Picatrix, it's the beam. It's 4 degrees Sagittarius to 17 degrees Sagittarius. The image is of the head and arm of a man and the body of a horse riding, holding a bow. So Sagittarius, the centaur. The election is for taming wild and disobedient beasts, and road travel and quick return, and men to come when you wish, and good people to join together, and other things. The talisman is for hunting in the fields. And then in the PGM, the animal is a deer. So like always in related mythologically with hunting and arrows and like Artemis and the deer and the bow and arrow. And then the Grimorium Verum spirit brings people from far away. That's almost exactly out of the Picatrix, where you can make people come when you wish and join good people together and travel and return quickly. And then the Kimbanda Eshu is Eshu das Matas, of the forests or of the bushes. And so this is a spirit of hunting. And then you'll often see within Kimbanda, when what the Picatrix is talking about, bringing something or transporting something or moving people or things around, the Kimbanda Eshu almost always has something to do with hunting and tracking, and is more of kind of like a hunter-tracker spirit. And so there's this really weird animalism that occurs through the filter of the Grimorium Verum, which might be closer to the logic of the Greek magical papyri, that ends up getting dispersed in the Picatrix into the possibly the aims of a culture that's mostly concerned, you can see from the electional list, of plundering and profiteering. And so here's another example. In the 21st Lunar Mansion, the city, the image is a man with two faces, one forward, one behind. Maybe we're talking about Janus. The election is, we'll skip the elections and stuff and just look down at like the PGM being the Dragoness, and the Grimorium Verum bringing a spirit that brings books. You know, so here's the name of the city, a place of commerce, and an election for firming profits. A Dragoness typically guards treasure, and the multiform makes sense for the city itself being a multiform place of market and people, a confluence of cultures. The Humots, the spirits, brings books, which normally you would buy in a city. You wouldn't be getting those in rural places. And the Eshu is of stones, which I think when in Kimbanda, when they talk about stones, it often sounds similar to like the suit of coins in tarot. So bringing wealth in some way, and maybe in kind of some market sense. So we see with, here we can just like glance at a few things. This is the 7th Lunar Mansion. In the PGM, it's the dog. In the Grimorium Verum, it's the spirit. It's a deputy of Astaroth. And so this is sort of like being like Cerberus as a, an attaché to Hecate, and then guarding the underworld. And then the Kimbanda Eshu is Eshu Veludo, or animal hide, or shaggy, which is a messenger god, a messenger for a hunter god. And so we get like that shaggy hide, the animal of a dog, relating to Cerberus. And this is also a place that would be precessed to the dog star Sirius, and also this kind of increasing merchandise and profit and safe travel. And then in the Kimbanda Eshu is a messenger, so that's similar to a mercurial role. So I just kept doing that, and that's what's in the article that I'll give you all a link to. And a lot of questions come up in this comparison stuff, like the animism just pops right out. Like, do we have to be working in an animistic modality? Are the boundaries soft or are they hard? Like, are things overlapping? We'll see like things in the comparisons be, well, this obviously relates with the next mansion over rather than this one. So are things shifted around, or are they elastic? Like, are these lists incorrect to each other? Or where in solar astrology, everything fits so tightly, like in Greek, with the Greek optical theory and things like that, like of the Thema Mundi and all the like the hardbound rules and structures. But in a lunar modality, are things just kind of more stretchy and changeable? And then, do people have resonance with these places and these spirits? Like, who are these spirits anyway? If they seem to like, just the intelligence of the Picatrix can be reflected into like a culture, the Brazilian Kimbanda, that probably didn't have a Picatrix that they looked at. They just looked at this other manual of invoking these spirits that doesn't say a lot about their nature, but then what develops about those spirits comes out to be some of the same things we see within the Picatrix. Like, so do these spirits live in the sky? You know, do they gravitate to these places of the sky and to these stars? And people that seem to develop relationships with various spirits seem to have associated parts of the zodiac as where those one of those 28 places land, and then even people that have prominent places within those parts of the lunar zodiac tend to have certain kinds of relationship with each other, and I think often dream into the same place. So here's some Lunarium is being reconstructed, but you can look at Lunarium for a mansion kind of lunar calendar. Planet Watcher you can use as a visual ephemeris. Astro.com, you can generate charts. Renaissance Astrology and Medieval Astrology Guide, places like that. You can get a lot of information on how the mansions are used as described in the Picatrix, and you can make talismans just for people that are interested in that. Like, just jot down these websites and you can probably just be look at a copy of the Picatrix and you can be experimenting with lunar mansion talismans. But from a more nocturnal approach, we might involve materials and experience and nature and the observable and the body and direct engagement with kind of the sky territory itself, you know, and just kind of work directly into like completing a cosmogenetic and eschatological universe to operate in, giving us a grounding for openings of magical workings and real phenomena, and a timing and contextualization of living within inhabited time and connecting to the most primal theory-formal modalities, kind of pre-glyph, pre-character abstraction, magic before signs and magic seals and magicals with animals, and the sky and your body and the earth. And that even goes back to very early astrology describing people's character by the animal characteristics of the zodiac, where they have placements. Yeah, and harnessing the direct power of the imagination and synthesis with cyclical empowered intelligences and getting to know them personally and deeply and forming collaborative relationships. Here's some chart examples. Here's like Aleister Crowley's chart, and he has his moon in the 28th lunar mansion. The Picatrix says that's the place for congregating fish in one place. That's also the same place where one of his main followers, Jack Parsons, has his moon, also in the 28th lunar mansion. And they were both essentially cult leaders. They were both like avid Egyptianists. And this is where we get the mention related to the Sphinx. And these guys were obsessed with the idea of crossing the desert and the city of pyramids. And Jack Parsons wrote Liber 49, which is a confusing book. And Aleister Crowley famously wrote the Book of Lies, which is a book of riddles, which is something that we know relates to sphinxes. Here's David Bowie, Lunar Mansion 10. This is where in the Grimorium Verum we would find the intermediary spirit Skirlin, who brings all of the other spirits to the conversation, kind of the switchboard operator. And David Bowie brought forth the careers of Iggy Pop and Luther Vandross and Stevie Ray Vaughan and Brian Eno, and he was a famous band leader. He was also considered a trickster, as most intermediaries are, and he was both an actor and a mime. So that possession states, and this is the 10th lunar mansion in the PGM, would be the horse. And so like being ridden, as we would say, like in in possession-based traditions. And he also was considered, he was an occultist himself and was considered an alien. And aliens are even ones that are legionary. If you see one gray, there's probably many more. And so Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights, a deeply necromantic novel, a sequestered psychosocial novel with the 4 elements prominent thematically, especially water. And she wrote famously, "I've dreamt in my life dreams that have stayed with me ever after and changed my ideas. They've gone through me and they've gone through and through me like wine through water and altered the color of my mind. And this is the Picatrix mansion that's called the Gap, like kind of an empty place of stars, like a void. And here we have in the PGM the animal, the wolf, and then if you've read Wuthering Heights, this kind of like wolf-like nature is very prominent in the story. And in Kimbanda, this is Eshu dos Rios, Eshu of the rivers, and working with that water element as like the Grimorium Verum is the deputy of Astaroth, and kind of this kind of Cerberus at the necromantic kind of the river Styx. And so this is the last one, but Charles Baudelaire, this one's kind of like dead on, who most famously wrote Fleur de Mal, The Flowers of Evil. And this is Lunar Mansion 9, which the Picatrix says is for destroying crops. And here we have the Flowers of Evil. And this is also the serpent. So the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And this is where we'd find the Grimorium Verum chief Astaroth, who brings the favor of kings, and as an ability. And Baudelaire was often supported by the aristocracy, and was kind of a chthonic type figure who always talked about causing infirmity and the fetishism with the spleen and the melancholic humor. And so that's not exactly how I'm envisioning using the lunar mansions, but or the lunar zodiacal 28 places, but just looking at those comparisons of various lists we might find, and then looking at charts, and you can kind of see some stuff pop out that it does have some weight into how we might look at natal astrology. Do we have some questions?
Yeah, there's a few questions there. Nikki is wondering if there's links for the spreadsheets also, or in the lists.
Not the spreadsheets, but all the list itself that'll be in that link. It's just my website /articles that has all the information that is coming from the spreadsheets.
And then Spencer asked, can we delineate other planets in the different mentions in the natal chart, or would you mostly examine the moon?
There's kind of a lot to say about that. And that's what we're going to go into more in a couple months in the workshop modality. We definitely have a bunch of ideas about that, not exactly, because it's still something that's just kind of forming, but some more concrete ideas about how you interpret that. But I think just as far as your own investigations, I would, just look at whatever is in a mansion and see if things are popping out and it seems to make sense.
There's no more question, but I don't know if anybody wants to get on the mic and ask anything. I think everybody's just digesting this.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to do some like summary statements in the meanwhile. So we can look for more information available to consider even in natal astrological approaches than out of strictly looking at its secular astrological texts. Once natural and even indigenous practices would end up like into the grimoires have been marginalized since the rise of urban elites. Ancient expressions of Orphism and Goetia and chthonic cults proliferated in Greek colonial territories. And the Picatrix's paradigm, as we were saying, the Picatrix is fine as its own tradition, but we can only read it through its paradigm, where often certain kinds of spirit conjuration were forbidden. And electional information makes clear the text was utilized by probably magicians, hired at least often by soldiers and warlords who have their own designs, which affect what the elections are mentioned for. So it's harder to draw tons of information from them. So if we consider animism and the sky being alive and having agency and being inhabited, that the lunar mansions are tuned to similar frequencies that might be like almost like music you're tuned to in your natal chart, like a radio frequency. We don't all have to conjure spirits and conjure demons, but just kind of starting to think about like what literature's astrological and what literature isn't astrological. Like if these grimoires are loaded with astrology and they detail inhabitants of these parts of the sky, that we might start looking into them to gain more information about who might be living in the sky that we're living with and under. You know, in the firmament in general, this is something that I've said a couple times, but not tonight. You know, when the sun goes below the horizon in some of these older traditions, it was thought to be sort of like Apollo going into the underworld and projecting what he sees in the underworld up to his place, which is the sky, and the stars in the firmament above are like the souls and spirits of the underworld and of the spirits of the other world projected into the sky above our heads, and the moon passing over it gives us access in mind, body, soul, psychology, imagination, dream, physiology, to those stars directly, and gives us a kind of way of knowing them and making meaning, and kind of might even be what is talked about with like witch flight of the Sabbath, or with like Lucifer's fall, and like the fallen angels, like or you know, like the kind of going up at least to the sublunar roof above in our own world, and coming back down. I could go on, but I want to answer questions if there are questions.
There's a few statements. Jason, this might be what you're planning for the workshop, but what is an exercise you would recommend to fill into these lunar places?
Yeah, that's definitely what we're going to go into in the workshop. And we'll get into that then, like more specific exercises, but I would just say, just for now, just like you can just start keeping track of where the moon is, and just trying to get a feel for it, and just trying to see what things occur and what things you notice as the moon goes around through like a kind of 28 place division, which would be the that tropical 12 degree 51 minute division. But you could also track the sidereal zodiac at the same time.
Also, paying attention to your dream depending on where the mentions are. It's another good, sometimes you'll get good clues. Kate, one thing I don't fully understand, the mentions work by tropical degree regardless of how precession of the equinoxes has shifted the fixed stars associated with the mention?
Yeah, that's so I think that there's strangeness there even in the Picatrix itself. I kind of mentioned that it almost seems like they're going two different directions at once, because some amount of precession, I think 13 degrees would have occurred between the classical era and you know, like 1000, when around the time that the Picatrix was penned. So I don't know if they're how aware they are, or like how organized they are around precession when the Picatrix is talking about the degrees and the stars, but they're getting those Greek ideas of the tropical zodiac, and then they're getting those sidereal ideas of from India, and they're kind of mixing them. And that's why I was kind of talking about like this personage of Al-Biruni knowing all these different languages, pulling information from all these different cultures, and bringing stuff back up from India, and Arabic astrology being kind of a blend of Indian and Greek and Persian and Babylonian ideas. So I'm not exactly sure exactly what they're pointing to in the Picatrix, because they're also describing Arabic constellations from another time period. But they're the 28 system, you know, it breaks up into 4 sets of 7 in Chinese astrology, as well as into, you can tell like in the PGM list, it also breaks up into 7s because of that last set switch at the final 7. And then the Picatrix explicitly zeroes out at equinox and solstice points. And so I just think that's why I was trying to stress, rather than thinking of the tropical zodiac as seasonal exactly, just that the most important part is that it's a division of night and day, and a division of like day sect and night sect, and how much light and how much equalization of light and darkness. And then that in itself is in an important yearly and monthly cycle. And that the position within that is certainly important as the moon goes around and remembers that cycle. And that those equinox and solstice points are good markers, and there's 7 mansions between all of them, and that whatever stars happen to be there now, where we're processed to, because we're not we're talking about 28 lunar places. You can kind of just forget, not for the purpose of lunar zodiacal interaction, just forget that place is Aries, or forget that place is Cancer, or forget that place is Gemini, or whatever. You're only using the words Aries or Cancer or Gemini just to know what part of the zodiacal loop we're talking about. But really, you're just trying to see which of the 28 lunar places you end up in, and that you can observe what kind of phenomena happens from that part of that cycle, that tropical cycle, and what might be related to the stars that are also happen to be there now. So I kind of look at it as like there's one layer of fixed stars, and there's one layer of this light darkness cycle, and they're just superimposed, and they're 2 different things that are happening simultaneously, and you can get information from both of them.
Jason, does it make sense to try from a praxis standpoint to ignore daily planetary transits to try to fill into the position of the moon alone? I feel like, I don't know, I've personally been just making a space in the evening once the moon rises, or once the moon is like high in the sky, just to go into the space. But personally, as an astrologer, I always take in consideration all the other planets. I don't like ignore it. It's sort of like multi-layered perspective. But like to create, I think my computer's gonna crash. Yeah, like if you want to just like tap into the like lunar zodiac and where the moon is, you could create like a special time in the evening just for that, instead of like coloring or filtering your whole day with it. What would you say?
Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. I think it varies, and I think with a lunar type modality, it's fine to have variation and changeability. It's not so hardly fixed. I do think that like when the moon is in one of the places, that the whole world we live in is sort of submerged within that place, and that we just kind of live in a bath of it, and that whenever you decide to kind of start noticing it, you're already there, and that as astrologers, we can't we sort of can't ignore all the other transits that are going on, but like Elodie was saying, it's just sort of it's other layers of information that we just already know about, you know. And so yeah, kind of more of the same answer with the with precession. It's just like, yeah, there's all these layers of sensory like data accumulation, and this is just one particular one, but maybe one that's kind of a strangely like one of the biggest or closest ones. It's like almost like it's so close to us we haven't noticed it much, but it's like we're right in it, like body, mind, soul, psyche, imagination, dream, just like kind of swimming in this thing that we're never looking at.
Yeah, exactly. It's more like if we think about like tropical zodiac, the solar zodiac, we think about it. We think about the transit. We sort of filter it through our mental experience. And then the lunar zodiac is more like you're getting in a bathtub of milk. Or you're just feeling the space, as opposed to like thinking about this space or like filtering it through your mental experience, which is way more solar.
Yeah, I was thinking about how like when we think with our suns, we clarify and defend astrology's validity and things like that. You know, we're like, this is rational, it makes sense. When we think with our Mercuries, like we can study and organize and research and practice. You know, astrology is like an art, and we think with our Jupiters, we philosophize over it, and we can look to myths and archetypes for answers or find teachers. And when we think with Saturn, we can see what our techniques can do and cannot do, and use Time Lord techniques, especially in predictive methods. But when we like try to think with like the moon and the rest of the mansions, it doesn't, it gets into a whole other kind of like body experience. It's highly subjective. But that doesn't mean surrendering what the day sect does normally to just like pure obscurity of blurry night, but to seek out like astrologically something that's other than accurate delineation and prediction, you know, and kind of engage ourselves in activities that are more intimate and shared. You know, it's like the moon. It's like it's nighttime. It's nocturnal. It's the night sect. It's a time for things that are more intimate, things that are shared with fewer people, things that happen behind closed doors, things that happen under the cover of night, things that are blurry and they're impressionistic, and you go to touch them and you're like, what is this thing? And it doesn't always make sense, and it kind of gets away from you. And you can choose various guides, like, you know, like Hecate with torches, or even like thinking through Dionysian and like animal type mythos, like you can have an animal that can see better in the dark than you, you know, and call upon that. It's like these kinds of imaginal things that interface with you all the time. Like you're always in your imagination. Even when you're doing mundane things, you're sort of daydreaming. And it's probably on these kinds of registers that a lot of this stuff will hit in your consciousness while you're still, like, if you stop and think about your Mars transit, it's still there, you know.
I think that's pretty much it, Scarlett. Lunar zodiac bats is something I want to try.
Totally. Yeah. We're basically telling you to all take more baths. You know?
Kate, how relevant do you think it might be to work with Lunar Mansion and 7th harmonic aspect? Extension, i.e. 14th, 21st, 28th harmonic in tandem.
I don't know. I haven't really worked with that very much. Do you?
No.
Melody? No. But certainly try it out, you know.
And we have a lot of ideas on how to work with lunar zodiac and like how to get there. We have like methodologies. So yeah, there will definitely be a next chapter, or like a couple of workshop coming with more like practical applications of this stuff.
Yeah, and those might be like a couple meetings or one long meeting, or I don't know how they'll be, but we just kind of wanted to lay a lot of these things out there, and we're putting up articles on the Lunar Zodiac website regularly, and trying to fill out a lot of our ideas and make it available. But this particular lecture is just kind of like get acquainted with like kind of where we're at. This lecture is a lot of like kind of my thinking process up to the point of starting to explore and develop methodologies. So it's kind of like a bringing people in the community up to speed with where our work is at, so we can continue to dialogue from here, because it's kind of a different and kind of like obscure perspective.
Jason, is there an online group space to talk through these ideas, or will that be post-workshop space? Definitely post-workshop space.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the workshop, we definitely want who joins in the workshop, we also want that to be sort of like a group of people that'll stay in touch at least for a while, so that we can also get more information about how our ideas and our methodologies are actually like setting off with people. Because LOD, we have certain placements, as everyone has certain placements that might incline us towards certain kinds of synchronicities, that other people might end up having different kind of synchronicities because of their various placements, and we'd like to see that. So there'll definitely be a kind of like workshop community that comes together after we do that.
Yeah, basically the idea is that the workshop we're going to put in place is still going to be part of our research process, and therefore something that will be sort of like not to be spread on Instagram right away type thing.
Yeah.
There might be like, there might be an agreement to sign that you guys are participating in this research process, and we're going to accumulate the data of like whoever participates in the workshop. We're going to accumulate the experience of everybody just to do comparison. Because we have a lot of info on each placement, each places of the lunar zodiac, but like Chris was saying, we need other perspective too. There's a really reflective quality with the lunar zodiac, so that's an interesting thing, like the reflective dynamic that happens with others.
Yeah, like if you start I don't know, it'll be really interesting to see what happens to move it into a workshop format and a community type format, and see what kinds of like how we start like feeding into each other's synchronicities, and what kind of feedback loops occur between people, and what kind of I don't know, we have a lot of theories about that. There's like a whole dimension of kind of lunar zodiacal synastry that that might operate on things like who you might collaborate well with artistically, or just, and definitely the whole dream radio scenario. But we'll get there when we get there. But that's like what's coming up next.
Yeah, I think that's it. There's no more question. I don't see anything else coming in.
Okay, well, thanks very much for I have no idea how long that was, but it's probably kind of long, and thanks very much for sitting through it, and thank you for your attention and your interest. And definitely more to come. There'll be, other than the workshop, there'll probably be like additional lectures, definitely articles eventually on like, things like as we accumulate information on, which animal mythologies kind of layer up to the PGM list, and how that reflects across the different things that we've pulled together from cross comparison. And then we're working on like a better and better image of the 28 places that that we can look at and start to use and share. But this is kind of the beginning. This brings us up to speed so we can all continue to dialogue about this soon
Thanks,
enough.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you.